Hello, everybody. This is Dr. John Miller, and this is a beginning lecture on the subject of marriage and the family, specifically with regard to a thing I would call the family life cycle. So we'll get into detail about this. This is largely based on the textbook that I would refer to called The Expanded Family Life Cycle by Betty Carter and Monica McGoldrick. Um, yeah, uh, the the philosophy that we're talking about and this largely comes from Monica and McGoldrick's book, The Expanded Family Life Cycle, and it's founded on a man's work, a famous family therapist, one of the first in the world, really, in the United States anyway, a guy named Murray Bowen, who you'll hear me talk a lot about during the class. He understood that problems in families often do not begin with the one person who has them, but develop over time in what he would call an intergenerational perspective. So it's sort of problems, a way to think about it, sort of stack up across generations, maybe starting with grandma and grandpa's dilemma, and then passed on to the parents, and then passed on to the current generation. All right. From this perspective, a family is looked at as more than the sum of the parts. This is a line from Gestalt psychology, where that line is used. Gestalt psychology is a type of psychology that says, well, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And this goes for a family as well. A family is, you may look at it as a collection of discrete members, but actually they operate together in a group in a thing that we would call, or a term we use to describe this is a system. And you'll hear me talk a lot about system and systems thinking and systems therapy throughout the class. All right, the individual life cycle we all have, right, from before we're born, and then when we're born, and then early childhood, or infancy, early childhood, uh, up to adolescence, then launching, then with middle age, and so on, development of a human individual through to eventual death. Well, that sort of idea also happens with in families. Families go through predictable life cycles, family life cycles. In the American family, there are six. The Chinese family, I would maintain, are perhaps a slight bit different than the American family life cycle. Most of what I'll teach you is based on the American family life cycle, but I know enough about Chinese families. I'll show you some of the variations that occur across cultures. All right, and from this point of view, from a family therapist's point of view, or a social worker who sort of looks at things this way, dysfunction, the things that send people to social workers and therapists and so on, is viewed in relation to family functioning over time. This is that intergenerational perspective that I was talking about. And essentially, therapy or social work or psychotherapy or family therapy basically looks at this idea that families get stuck developmentally in their momentum or their movement forward. And our job is to assess where they got stuck when they come in. This is kind of a simple metaphor, but it holds for now. And then to figure out what's keeping them stuck, and then to remove those barriers or to encourage growth or resilience is an idea we'll talk about even today, to get them moving again, to moving through this cycle of life, both individually and as a family. Uh, so this is what I was talking about before. The clinical perspective from this point of view, from the life cycle point of view, is that people get off track. They get derailed is another term for it in the family life cycle. And our job is to get them back on their developmental track where they would typically be. You may think of this as developmentally by age. Um, if you go to a pediatrician and they, even as a baby, when babies first come out, into the world, and there's a test called the APGAR test, because even from the moment you're born, you're supposed to be starting to cross developmental tracks or developmental milestones, they call them sometimes. The APGAR test is a test for that for newborn babies. They make a little snap by their ear, they flash a light in their eye, they do various things tactily to show are their basic systems of input and output working. That kind of idea continues through our whole life. And it's true for families too. So there's a developmental track on which we're supposed to be on. One way you could think of doctors, medical doctors, as well as social workers, assess people is they look at someone and they sort of look at, well, for their age or where they are, this is what they would typically be doing for their normal development, and are they off of that, or have they missed that milestone? Becomes a fundamental way you sort of assess people uh, from this life cycle perspective. Oh, there we go. Okay, from this point of view, as I was talking about, a family is comprised of an emotional system of at least 3 to 4 generations. That's why for this class, I ask you to do your own family life cycle and genogram, family life cycle, sorry, family history and your own genogram. So here's an example of I think this is the genogram for the author Eugene O'Neill is my guess that somebody did. Oh yeah, it must be because he's a playwright. So this would be a fairly typical depiction of a family genogram, and I'll explain it to you if you follow the laser pointer here. Eugene here is the what I would call the identified member, the identified patient if he was in therapy, and the name goes below. You put two redundant sort of squares around the symbol, or it is made up of two squares, showing that he's the focal member. And this came up in the student discussion about how do we decide who to focus the genogram on. There's 100 people, maybe some of them aren't relevant. Well, usually in this case, it's clear to me from this genogram that Eugene here is the focal member. The dates here indicate when he was born, 1883, and he died, or 1880 something there. Oh, and he died in 1953, I suppose. So he actually lived quite a while. It shows that he was married to Catherine at the time of his death, I assume. Catherine is denoted as a female. Females on this symbol system are circles, men are squares. It shows also that he had been married but divorced from Agnes. I actually would have symbolized this with the two slash lines right here, which I'll show you in class when we get there to show the divorce. And that he at one time was also married to Carlotta, it looks like. I can't read that very well. Anyway, so there's that. This shows that Eugene was the son of Mary here, who the X means that she passed away. The line below shows that she had an addictions problem. Oh, it says it out here to the side, a morphine addiction. This line here, linking her to James, shows that she was married to him. This line indicates marriage, and that James was an actor, and the cross through his symbol shows that he has passed away. The line going through the center there shows that he also had a substance abuse problem, although it doesn't say what it was, and so on. So you get the idea. This is a common system that we use in social work and in family therapy to map families to understand the complexity of the whole. The whole is more than the sum of the parts, right? Usually minimally 3 to 4 generations is needed to multi-generationally understand what's going on. So I'll talk to you in a minute about the stages of the intact middle-class American family life cycle, which I know are not typical of all families, and there are hundreds of variations of the American middle-class family life cycle, but it's a beginning point for us to begin to talk about this. Yeah, so the central underlying process is to be negotiated is the expansion, contraction, and realignment of the relationship system to support the entry, exit, and development of family members in a functional way. This means essentially a family is helping the individuals within that family move in and out of the family system through time, and to the sense that that gets disrupted sometimes, that's where you tend to see problems clinically. I'll give you 100 examples of that through this class. Each life cycle change I maintain requires what I would call, from systems theory, called second order change. Now, this is easy to say, but hard to understand. Actually, I have graduate students that are still trying to contemplate what the meaning of second order change is. But in short, what I would say is second order change is change at the level of process. So it's change at the level of rules. So when you move from being uh, a single adult, as probably most of you are, living alone at university, to moving on to the next life cycle stage, which for many people, not all people, is getting together with someone in a couple and maybe deciding to have children. A second order change, or a change at the level of rules or process, must accommodate that or go along with that transition from one stage to the next. usually with every member of your family, believe it or not. So when you get married, for instance, this is one of the subjects of this class, all the relationships within your family network or family system, as I would call it, require a second order change, which is a change at the level of rules or the change at the level of process. So where a brother or a sister had been and when there were certain rules about the nature of your relationship before you got married, they may change subtly after you get married, or maybe more profoundly, the relationship and the rules between you and your parents before you get married or before you enter a couple relationship become very different after. And that's why you see some conflict between parents and children once they bring a significant other into their life. There are 6 stages of the intact American middle class family life cycle. And again, I know this is just one example, but it's just, it's a beginning point. So, and it's arbitrary. It's like a circle, essentially. This idea of a life cycle, that we've all been passing through for thousands and millions of years, really, from birth to death, and then birth again, and so on. So arbitrarily, somewhere in the circle, we could begin by pointing at the launching of the single young adult. Most of you, I would guess, are at this life cycle stage. Although, some of you are maybe beyond that to the next stage, which is the formation of a couple, usually through marriage, although I also maintain that there's other kinds of couplings like LGBT couple relationships or other types of relationships that aren't marriage, essentially. Turns out that about 90 to 95% of our species will pair up with somebody at some point in life, but there are some people, maybe even 10% of the people that don't engage in that stage. They may go on they may skip that stage and go on to become parents and so on. But anyway, there are all kinds of variations. Let's move to the next stage, of course, is where that couple may decide to become parents and they become families with young children. And this is a special period of time in a family's development. It turns out to be the time of most existential rewards, but also the time of least couple or marital satisfaction. Anyway, we'll get into that throughout the rest of the class. The next stage is the transformation of a family system in adolescence. Adolescence usually begins at the age of 13. When that first child becomes an adolescent or reaches the age of 13, it's a special period of time. If there's conflict between the parents, the stage of the adolescence, they call it families with adolescent children, is where you tend to see volatility as a family therapist or social worker. And then families in midlife is when the children launch and move on. So this is the stage, if you're at this stage now, and you're, say, an only child, this is where your parents are in their own life cycle right now. They're at this family life cycle stage of launching, essentially, in their own midlife, usually. And then families in later life is sort of that last stage, the stage of after retirement, old age, moving towards the existential issues of life, even issues of life and death, and stuff like that. All right, the launching of the single young adult. So for the remainder here, for the next little bit, what I'm going to do is get into a little bit of detail of each of these life cycle stages. You kind of become, if you get into this field of study, you become a sort of an expert at looking at what are the characteristics of each of these stages and what do you expect someone to be going through and doing when they're at that stage. So at this stage, the completion of the stage requires that the young adults separate from the family of origin. Family of origin is where you came from, usually mom and dad, right? But it may be, for many Chinese families, this is grandma and grandpa. Grandma, maybe predominantly, is the one who raised you, and so you might consider grandma more the family of origin. But whatever it is for you, to separate without this idea of cutting off, and we're going to talk about cutting off in more detail later. Cutting off is a more extreme version of separating where there's little or almost no contact. Cut off is usually a sign that there's some problem going on in the family, and there's plenty of people that cut off, and I understand why, but as a therapist or a social worker, this is the thing we look for all the time. Or the other thing is fleeing reactively to a substitute emotional refuge. You sort of see this happen sometimes when people flee into maybe another relationship. They marry someone that they don't really know that well, through fiat, I would say, which means, just on the spur of the moment, uh, trying to flee from their own family of origin, perhaps, is the main thing. And during this period of time, the young person does a very important thing psychologically, which we call the creation of self, or, as Bowen would term it, a more precise clinical term is called differentiation of self. Differentiation of self, if there was one concept this famous doctor and therapist, who's passed away long ago, but Murray Bowen, that he talked about, was the importance of differentiation of self at this life cycle stage as a sort of insulator or protective factor for mental health issues later on in life. So he really sort of hung a lot on that fundamental concept or characteristic, and so that's we'll get into that a lot later. That becomes a major theme in this class. Sorry, yeah, went through too fast. This was Bowen's main idea for. I'm sorry. Differentiation itself, sorry, is Bowen's main idea about how to what he called it was the universal antidotes. Essentially, he said if you could do one thing to help somebody in situations where they have a thing that they would come to family therapy for, it would be the promotion of this differentiation of self. And this relates to the regulation of self from others, and also inside of your own head, essentially the separation of emotion from intellect. And so, not that Bowen was against emotion, but he thought that if you're doing things out of emotion, maybe making choices in life, then you should know and have control over it, so the emotions don't control you. You control your emotions, essentially, or at least sort of understand them from intellect, which is the problem-solving part of making decisions. So sometimes it's misunderstood that Bowen thought that we should just all be intellectuals and forget our emotions, and that's not at all what he was saying if you actually read his work. He thought this idea of differentiation was a universal antidote to mental health problems, as I said before. If you're in a system of people in interactions together, say in a family, that's not the only system that we might talk about. We probably will talk about during this class. Organizational systems, companies, work, for instance, is the system that you were going to spend most time with in adult life other than your family. In fact, most people spend more time with their work system. Anyway, if you're a social worker or a therapist trying to help that system, and you're trying to pick who to help the most, you tend to focus on the differentiation of the leader or the most powerful person in the family or the corporate system. Say it's the CEO of the company. It tends to be most useful because it spreads out through the system if the leader is well differentiated. Differentiation relates to one's ability to regulate their own reactivity emotionally and intellectually, I suppose, but mostly emotionally to situations in their family. Bowen said it's a lifelong process, that you never get done with it. It's a process rather than a goal. You're always doing it. It's a lifetime project. This is an actually quote from Bowen, with no one getting more than 70% done. So essentially, none of us reach perfect differentiation of self, except for maybe the few illuminating leaders of society, like the great, philosophers and so on, or religious leaders, perhaps. Maybe if there's one characteristic of them that was universal, it is probably this idea of differentiation of self. Another way, Bowen, this is a quote from Bowen, he said, differentiation is knowing where one, means you, where I end and another, maybe mom and dad, begin. So it's knowing who you are and being content with yourself, within yourself, knowing yourself, liking yourself, maybe understanding parts of yourself that you don't like, but at least understanding them, and being able to separate that from your sense of where other people are in life. And so the opposite of that you could think of is this thing that they were talking about of reactivity, one's reactivity to somebody else. So if you're making decisions and doing things simply through the process of reacting to someone else's behavior, say mom and dad, or husband or wife, or brother or sister, then that's the opposite of differentiation, because you don't know where one person, you, end and the other person begins, right? So There's whole books been written about this subject, so I'm just trying to give you a thumbnail description of it for now, and then we'll get into it later. This is a sort of joke one of my students gave me about differentiation of self, or boundaries. This concept of boundaries is used a lot in social work and therapy. It's not literally like this lady has a brick boundary. That's a literal boundary. A boundary, from this point of view, from the social work point of view, is a emotional rule set between people about distance. It controls the connection and reactivity to one another. And poor boundaries tends to be a sign of problems. You tend to see poor boundaries in families that produce a symptomatic member, someone who might end up in, depressed or anxious or whatever. You see good boundaries in situations in families where people do well. The dog here seems to understand this point very well. Not sure about the husband, though. All right, the emotional triangle is another concept from Bowen, and this may seem like new to you, but actually intuitively you all know it. The emotional triangle, the more complex way to say it, it refers to three parts of any emotional system, either three individuals or two persons in an issue. It could even be two persons and a pet. I think that's come up in one of the classes. That's why a lot of people, you would be surprised, in marriage therapy end up talking about their pets when they're discussing the problem, because they triangulate in this emotional triangle issue with their pet, their dog or their cat. So the way you can think about an emotional triangle is a situation where the anxiety of a two-person system, say a husband and wife, grows and grows, and a third person, maybe as a reaction to that anxiety between two persons, maybe it's two married people that just had their first kid, and they draw in a third person. Maybe it's the kid himself. Maybe they don't have a kid, but they got a dog. They bring in the dog, or maybe it's mom and dad. I don't know. But they bring in a third person to stabilize things when the anxiety between the two of them gets too great. This sounds complicated, maybe, and but it's not really. You all know it. Is that if you maybe friendship, I believe, is one of the ways we first learn about intimate relationships in life. And so maybe you can think of the last time you got in a big fight with one of your friends that you couldn't resolve. It is a common thing in that situation, probably the most common thing. If it can't be resolved and the anxiety goes on because of the conflict, it would not be uncommon for one or both of those people in conflict to call up a third friend. Ring, 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 and say something like, "Hey, can you believe what the other guy did? The person they're in conflict with." And maybe at the same time, that other guy is calling up the third friend as well, saying the same thing. So we all triangulate other people in life when we get in conflict. Triangulation in and of itself is not a pathology. It is a normal part of human interaction. It only becomes a pathology in certain situations, which I'll explain later. Here's another cartoon one of my students brought me that is actually, to me, in my mind, is a perfect example of triangulation. And the bartender says, this is a guy in a bar, and he brings in his couch, which implies sort of the therapist's couch. And the bartender says, "I don't mind listening to your problems, Ray, but the couch has got to go." So this is kind of a joke about therapy, and I think actually it's a lot of what happens for people. For instance, you can only maybe you imagine this guy here just had his girlfriend break up with him, or boyfriend or whatever, and he triangulates with the bartender. He comes to the bartender and says, like, "Can you believe what my partner did to me?" That action is actually what Bowen was talking about with triangulation. That would maintain even the relationship some people have with alcohol is a sort of triangulation thing, which is maybe it is he broke up with his partner, he feels anxious about it, so he triangulates, you could say, on alcohol, which is he turns to alcohol, maybe even has to think of a relationship with alcohol as a way to deal with the anxiety generated by his relationship with his partner. All right, the multi-generational transmission process. This is an emotional response. Both nature and degree of intensity are passed down from generation to generation. This is a thing that's easy to talk about, but and maybe not understand it. But I think most people intuitively understand it when you start to look at your own family. It's a continuous process with each generation pressing up against the next and moving and sort of from past to present to future. it becomes what I call a false dichotomy, a false this or that situation. Um, we are all a product of a multi-generational transmission process from this point of view. We are just the current generation, and we will soon move into the next life cycle stage. And this will pass until we're gone. But even when we're gone, we're not gone because we pass on down to the next generation's pieces of ourselves. And this can go back for hundreds, even thousands of years. And maybe it's not detectable to you, but in some ways, it cannot not have some influence in this thing, the whole is more than the sum of the parts sort of way of thinking. All right, so a therapist or a social worker investigates multi-generational transmission processes involved in delineating triangles between people, similarities of symptoms across generations. So if your patient, a young man is an alcoholic, you might find that his father was an alcoholic and his grandfather was an alcoholic and his great-grandfather was an alcoholic, all on his father's side. Now, you could think of this as a genetic issue, but a family therapist would be inclined to think of it as a multi-generational transmission process. And indeed, alcoholism, substance abuse, ways of managing anxiety are things that are really commonly passed down from generation to generation. Although each generation has a choice of not reacting to the transmission process, and this is, in a way, another way to talk about the self-differentiation process. So if all the men in the family were alcoholics, and then I am a young man in the family and I'm launching myself, I have the choice in a self-differentiation kind of way to resist the call to follow into the same multi-generational transmission process of dealing with anxiety through alcoholism. So it's easy to say and kind of hard to understand, but I'll try to give you examples through the class. Now, this may seem unrelated to this idea, but this is actually a picture I took on, actually, I do some work in Cambodia, which is in a very rural community at a monastery on the top of a hill in a forgotten province of Cambodia about 20 years ago. But anyway, I saw this picture up on the wall in this monastery that was thousands of years old, and understood it immediately from my point of view to be an intergenerational or multi-generational transmission process. So I think this idea for our species has been around for a long time. Now, I'm not trying to get into Buddhism or anything, but those of you who know about Buddhism understand that this picture is really the story of Buddha, which is this guy right here, before he became Buddha, becoming enlightened. And I'll tell you the story in just a thumbnail description. This is Buddha and one telling of Buddha. He was raised behind these walls in a princely land, that it was his father's house. And he had never in his whole life left the beautiful palace of his father's house until this day he finally said, I want to leave these walls because all I see inside these walls, because this is the way his father wanted it behind these walls, was only beauty, only youth, only the unspoiled flower and the healthy person, and no one old, no one dead, certainly, would be allowed behind the prince's walls. He said, I want to see the real world, so he got in his carriage and he had his attendant take him out to the real world, out into the city. And for the first time, this is the beginning of his awakening, he saw, for the first time in his life, he saw an old man. And he had never seen age before. And it shocked him because behind the palace walls, the father wouldn't allow anybody old. And he goes, oh, okay, so that's me. I'm going to get old too. And I think somewhere over here, he saw a sick man, or maybe that's somewhere else in the picture, and he'd never seen sickness before. And he realized, although I've never been sick because I've been behind the palace walls, I may one day get sick. And then the next thing he saw, although this is a gross sort of depiction, was the dead man. And he had never seen death before in any version of death. And I think he had an enlightenment there, and he realized, I am also going to die. This is the cycle of life, essentially. And then the final thing, I don't know if you can see it off in the distance here. Can you tell what it is? Those of you, if you're getting the idea of what I'm talking about, you will know what he sees here is a man holding a baby. And this is meant to depict this picture in the story of a Cambodian version of Buddhism, the cycle of life, and this is part of Buddha's awareness. Not to talk about Buddhism so much, which I don't really know that well, but just that this idea is an ancient idea. All right, let's get back to social work and family therapy. Bowen thought that the symptom location mattered, and he said that a family is healthy in so long as it is symptom-free in three places: the marital relationship, the health of one of the partners, mom or dad, either physical or mental, or in the health of the child, that if they have children, right? And this is because what they found was that, say there's a marital conflict, what might happen is that the child becomes symptomatic, we might call it, maybe starts failing school. Mom and dad put down their conflict and turn their attention to the kid, which is a kind of short-term solution to the marital conflict. But as soon as the kid starts going to school again and starts behaving again, it's a return to the marital conflict. But maybe next time, instead of the marriage conflict, the kid maybe doesn't get sick or have trouble at school, but maybe the health of one of the partners comes up. And we see this happen sometimes. People sometimes end up having migraine headaches, and I'm not even sure they're faking it, but they may develop a physical symptom as a way of dealing with a marital relationship problem. So some physical problems are a product of relationship conflict. Some mental problems, depression, anxiety especially, are the result of relationship problems. And this is sort of the theme of family therapy and social work. And marriage is viewed as successful only to the extent that the nuclear family is symptom-free in all three of these locations: the couple conflict, the couple relationship, the individual health of each of the couples, and the health of the child. Intergenerational interventions. From Bowen's point of view, this guy Bowen, Carter McGoldrick's book, The Expanded Family Lifecycle, is based on this idea. Your general intervention as a social worker, and again, this is great generalities. You should really go to graduate school and study for years to actually intervene with people, but just to give you the basic idea, Bowen's idea was you help the symptom bearer, we would call it, which is the one who is holding the symptom. Maybe it's an alcoholic teenager, right? From this point of view, because the whole is more than the sum of the parts, right? The alcoholic teenager's symptom, alcoholism, may be seen in relation to some family conflict. Maybe it's the result of some sort of pathological family triangulation process. And differentiation of self, differentiation of this symptom bearer becomes an important part of the sort of healing process for the family. All right, the other is to lower the anxiety in the family as a whole. This idea of anxiety comes up over and over again in the literature. Even Freud talked about it, he was sort of the grandfather of all psychotherapy. Freud understood it as well as a thing that is relevant to all pathologies in families. You know, there was one correlating thing that goes along with pathologies in individuals and families is a heightened sense of anxiety. And if you can bring down the anxiety, you tend to bring down the problems, and you increase sort of the health of the family. And finally, I've talked about this idea of cutoff. This is another thing, and we already talked about it. The Bowen would try to do where he found cutoff, he would try to prevent it or stop it or re-engage. Maybe it's a young person who's cut off from their family of origin. So this is just a thumbnail. Again, it's an orientation for the rest of the class. We'll bring up these subjects again and again and again. All right, other intergenerational interventions. The reframing of the problem instead of an individual is instead more as you sort of reframe it as a multi-generational problem. So if a young person has alcoholism and he does his genogram and he looks back and he realizes every adult male on dad's side had alcoholism, then you might reframe that as, well, part of that's your contribution to the problem, not to absolve everybody of responsibility for their own behaviors, but part of that might be you could reframe or re-story essentially the situation as a intergenerational or multi-generational transmission process where you're inclined to this way of solving problems, alcoholism, because of the multi-generational transmission especially among men on the father's side of the family, just to get making up an example. So that's this generally you're going to hear this term a lot, this idea of reframe if you get into social work. And finally, detriangulation, especially unhealthy detriangulation. So where you see, say, mom and dad who are in conflict, and probably some of you have experienced this. I know I did when I went off to college and I was the youngest child in my family of origin. And say mom and dad got in a tiff or something, or it means an argument, they might pick up the phone and call me and say, "Can you believe what your mother did? Can you believe what your father did?" Right? Well, this is a triangulation. And if triangulation, again, I said is normal. Unhealthy triangulation, one type of unhealthy triangulation is triangulating across generational lines. And this is where maybe parents triangulate their kids, grandparents triangulate grandkids. These are all examples of that. It tends to be unhealthy for the one who is at the lower level of the generations. All right, intergenerational interventions. This is this is continuing the theme of what we've been talking about. You try to create connections across generations. This might be something like having maybe the identified patient, the one with the problem. Maybe again, I've been choosing drinking problems, but it may be something else. Maybe it's anxiety problems. May go to talk to grandfather, the grandparent of the same gender, or they might go talk to an aunt about this issue. Uh, so that's creating cross-generational coalitions. Avoiding fusion and distancing. These are sort of like the idea of cutoff and differentiation. Fusion is the opposite of sort of cutoff. This is where you become too close with somebody. Fusion is sort of like another term for it is enmeshment, they say, which is where two people are so close they can't sort of function as individuals together. All right, distancing is the process by which you get distance from someone else in your family as a way to manage anxiety. And it's not as severe as cutoff, but it's something like it. All right, just to give you a sense of things that therapists do, the toleration of individual differences within a family, it's one characteristic you see in families that have problems is that there's the opposite of this, there's an intolerance of individual differences within the family system. So maybe it's that all men must be this and all women must be this in this family, or it's maybe, father is always this and mother is always that, and that's just the way it goes, and you must listen to us instead of, following your own career path or whatever. And finally, an awareness of the societal emotional process, and this is a more complicated idea that we won't get into too much, but even societies are like families. Families are comprised, from this point of view, of societies are comprised of families, and the society goes through as a group an emotional process. And sometimes you see this passed down through generations. For instance, my parents grew up during the Great Depression in the United States, where a lot of people were starving. Their reaction to that as children growing up in that environment was the social scientists talked about the societal emotional process. They said essentially people came out of it one of two ways. They were either luckies, as the term in quotes, or never agains. And the never agains were those who said, that was horrible. We almost starved to death when I was a kid. That is never going to happen to me again. And they organized their whole life to make sure that never happens to them again. Maybe they become misers, save all their money, put it under the mattress. And maybe you're not so happy about that. The others are the luckies. The luckies are the ones, and their societal emotional process was maybe they say something to themselves afterwards, like, wow, that was horrible. I hope that never happens again. Oh my goodness, we're so lucky to have survived it. And then everything that happens to them after that is like, great, look at that. We can afford to go out to dinner. We're so lucky, right? Our parents couldn't do that. So this is just a sociologist sort of description of this idea of Bowen's societal emotional process. Well, we all are a product of that, are influenced by that, not a product of, but are influenced by that in small ways in life. All right. Okay, more intergenerational interventions to keep a positive emotional process. This is the process by which, instead of dealing with problems through, conflict and negativity, problem solving, compliments, and more encouraging the positives than the negatives. Creating a family positive emotional climate. This is again a version of this positive emotional process. And a therapist, it may seem strange, but may actually have people write letters to express concerns to one another. This is in situations where there might be cutoff between people. All right. What is it that promotes resilience in individuals? This is a thing we're going to talk about a lot through the remainder of the class. This is an area of science in social science called resiliency studies. This is the term resilience. It means how do people manage to bounce back after difficulty? And this will come up again, but this is in the class later on in some lectures. But there's been studies of this. Most of us, when we take a hit or a trauma in life, we don't recover from it very well. Maybe we have bad dreams or anxiety or depression for years to come. But there are some people we have found that actually do recover from it and go on to do have successful lives, and the trauma of their life doesn't really affect them that much. What is it about those people? Well, it turns out these characteristics are the ones that we can identify and the ones that were resilient. So what they did is they looked at people that were resilient, that had a trauma but overcame it, and they started looking at what are the commonalities of those people. And we'll talk about these one by one. Easygoing temperament, that's sort of easy to understand. This is as an individual, self-esteem, a sense of hope for the future, a sense of personal control, spiritual resources, and it doesn't really matter which one. It can be any one, um, as long as it leads to sort of I think the reason spiritual resources are so important is because they promote a sense of meaning. Learned optimism, which is a sense that, hey, everything's going to work out, life is okay, and creativity. Oh, and finally, humor. Humor is important. Humor turned out to be one of those factors that really mattered. All right, systems also are resilient, and these are some of the characteristics of systems that are resilient. Access to at least one caring parent, a warm environment. These seem kind of obvious, and sort of this idea of flexibility in the family, that each family has its own ecological niche or has its own way of functioning, and that's okay.